right, everybody. Thanks for tuning in once again to another episode of Trending Echoes, brought to you by Trends Research and Advisory. I'm your host, Omar, and we are here in the beautiful Expo City in Dubai. And this time we talk a little bit more about geopolitics. We are in the presence of an expert. His name is Mmathew غودوين. He's a program lead of geopolitics in the Middle East. Mr. غودوين, welcome to the studio.
Pleasure, sir. Thank you for having me.
So, a lot of interesting elements revolve around climate change, sustainability. Let's start with talking about some of the positives. What are some of the opportunities that you see, in your opinion, that can be a result of COP28 happening right here in the UAE?
I mean, there's two things that have come out of this COP already that I think are really fantastic steps forward. The first is the Loss and Damage Fund. It was first agreed upon last year at Sharm el-Sheikh, and now we've got close on $1 billion coming up on day 9 of COP here. And I mean, to see that continuity, that momentum go from one COP to the other, both in the region, it's an extraordinary story. And loss and damage funding is critical. I mean, it's critical for everywhere in the world, but especially for the global south and emerging countries, which are both suffering the most significant effects and impacts from climate change, but also have the least ability, basically, to mitigate and adapt to those impacts. And so what you see is a story of the region and a story of the UAE kind of leading the way to address those challenges. And that's a very good story. And the other aspect of it is the climate finance piece. And we've seen tens of billions of dollars committed, especially from the private sector, in the UAE and other countries when it comes to climate finance. And for me, what climate finance is it's the essence of the just transition. They talk about a just transition as basically affluent countries, the global north, principally Western countries, paying their fair share to ensure that principally global south, emerging countries, many of which still heavily dependent on fossil fuels, can transition out of the fossil fuel sort of sectors, extraction-intensive industries, and towards more diversified, sustainable economies, but without losing the momentum, the standard of living that they've been able to achieve, and to continue to contribute towards sustainable development goals. And that, the interesting thing about climate finance is that, for me, what we've seen in the past is a lot of the contributions that the global north have made to emerging countries has been development aid, which is to say, there's been a limited amount of agency when it comes to countries and businesses that have been receiving money over decades for overseas development, et cetera. Climate finance is a bit different. Part of it is ODA, part of it is sort of concessional loans, whatever you want to call it, but a big part of it, and we've seen that emphasized in the UAE at this COP, but in general, is support for entrepreneurship and business, and in particular renewable and sustainable business and renewable and sustainable sectors. And that gives global south and emerging countries a new kind of agency and a new kind of autonomy when it comes to economic growth, very different from what they had before. And I'll just end this piece on talking about the geopolitics situation. What we're seeing now, after several decades of kind of a unipolar world, moving into this multipolar world where the US and the West and China and Russia are competing for influence in various regions of the world, is a new kind of transactional type of geopolitics where countries don't necessarily want to be on the US side or on the Russia side or on the China side. They're happy to have breakfast with China and lunch with the United States, depending on what's on offer. And I think that the climate change is certainly a universal issue, but it's also, there is an element of geopolitics in this where I think those countries that are providing climate finance that advances the interests of societies in emerging and developed countries could be an element of this geopolitical power play that's happening. And I think it's in many ways a good thing that countries are now able to, I suppose, engage with great powers and other regions, regardless of what particular ideological alignment they happen to have. They just want the best for their people.
Right.
You know what I'm saying? Which
Absolutely.
is not a bad thing.
Now, also, it's very interesting that you say this, and that kind of brings me to the next question, which has to do with a lot of the conflict that emerges due to alternative energy sources and climate change, obviously. What is, in your opinion, the main reason behind that conflict? We understand in the Middle East, for as long as the world has been dependent on fossil fuel, this has been a very troubled area, obviously, because there's a certain element of energy supply, let's call it, right? Fossil fuels. How does this transition into, renewable energy, let's say?
I mean, I think there's two ways of looking at that. The first is that what they've said that climate change is a force multiplier for conflict, which is to say it doesn't necessarily instigate conflict in the same way that maybe ethno-national differences have, or that religious differences have. These sort of social cleavages that have been the principal mobilizing elements of conflicts that we've seen in the Middle East and elsewhere. I think what we have seen in the past is international intervention into regions and into challenges that are presented by those ethno-national and social differences, probably to a greater extent as a consequence of natural resources, as you rightly said. I don't think that's the only reason states have intervened in places like the Middle East, but it's undeniably, I'm sure, a factor in many cases. So it's a force multiplier. You've got water scarcity, you've got food scarcity, you've got farming and agriculture scarcity. One of my fellow panelists today gave an excellent example from Africa where you've got herders and farmers, sort of, the kind of the growers almost and the herders contesting land, diminishing amounts of arable land and land that can be used by both of those types of agriculture effectively. And we're seeing that, I think, in many respects, in many places, including other areas in Africa. But I also think that climate change, and I should also add, in terms of the geopolitical competition, coming back to that again, and one of the other panelists mentioned this rightly, is the critical minerals aspect, which that a lot of renewable technology, a lot of sustainable technology relies on critical minerals. So it's less about kind of the oil and gas, and it's more about smaller quantities of extremely important minerals that you have in your cell phone and everything else. And the ownership and access to those types of minerals is a key geopolitical battleground for major states and major producers. We talk about semiconductors in Singapore as one of these kind of critical areas of the global economy, and that being, sorry, not Singapore, Taiwan, and that being a kind of area of significant contestation when it comes to the challenges in that part of the world. Critical minerals are the same. They're the essence, I think, of the renewable energy sectors, and we'll see a lot more competition around that. Whether we'll see actual conflict, great power conflict, I think that's probably yet to be seen and maybe a bit dramatic, but that's undoubtedly a point of friction, I suppose, that you could see play out more in the future.
What would you like to see come out of this COP28? And I'm asking from a personal perspective. What are your expectations? What would you like to see come out of this COP?
I mean, one thing that I would like to see more of, I think this has been a successful COP, comparatively speaking. I don't think anybody can argue with that.
Sorry to interrupt you. When you say successful, how do we measure? I understand we spoke about the loss and damage fund. But in reality, in the future, how do we actually rate the success of any of these conferences? Is there some sort of measuring tool that we can use or something to put in place where we can say, okay, we managed to achieve what we wanted to, or we didn't? For
a long time, the measure of a COP's success was whether or not the international community and governments were saying, this is how much we're willing to let the Earth warm by, 1.5, et cetera,
right. What's
feasible. How much are we going to commit to climate finance? So it was almost a decade ago where the $1 billion commitment was made by affluent countries to contribute to climate finance for a just transition. We only just met that last month or something like that. It came out that it was finally met. So for me, those commitments are important, but what is more important is the actual contribution that states have made. So the tens of millions or the billions of dollars that are being committed by states and the private sector that underpin the commitments that are often made at other COPs. And that was the essence of this COP. That's what the UAE said it wanted to do. It was about delivery, pragmatic. We're not here to get more commitments are great, more goals are great, more objectives are great, but what we want to see is things actually moving. And that, for me, has made it a success. And especially where you had the loss and damage agreement at the last COP, and then you've got the commitment at this COP. My God, if we could continue to repeat that between COPs, that is a model for success. That is something that is really meaningful and substantive.
Now, speaking of conflict, there's conflict on so many different levels, even within the parties that are involved in this conference, not being able to come together on the same page. A lot of people talking about, we've got to have immediate full transformation right away. Some people saying that's not possible. How do you think, in your opinion, we can bring people together to some sort of agreement on how this transition needs to happen? You do that by having an equitable share of the burden, which is to say that you can have a global commitment for the temperature. You can have a global commitment for reduction, but there has to be an understanding that global south countries are going to need support from more affluent countries in order to make that transition possible and basically less hardship for their people. And so you've got to be sensitive to that, but you've also got to call out from time to time. Some people would say that China
is trying to say that it's still a developing country in many respects, and it shouldn't be held to the same standards as Western countries. Whereas a lot of people are saying, "Come on now,
Right.
you've made a significant amount of advances in the last few decades, and whether or not you consider yourself that or not."
Not to mention, don't they have pretty much control of majority of the minerals within Africa?
I mean, they have a significant amount of control over extraction, not just in Africa and many other places, and that's been. In many ways, China's been very smart. China has known for a long time that this is going to be a critical element of influence in geopolitics in the future. And in a lot of ways, Western countries are just catching up to some extent to challenge that. And that's where you get these sort of friend-shoring and reshoring, where you've got allied countries that are building markets that are, they will call it resilient, but basically what they are contained to countries that they trust.
Right.
And I think people can appreciate where that logic comes from. But when it excludes, we're not just talking about China, we're talking about emerging countries that, as I said before, will have breakfast with one part of the world and lunch with another. And then you've got, the US or China saying, well, no. I mean, you can't have it both ways. If you're going to deal with us, then you've got to agree to engage with us on critical minerals or on particular types of technology. We've seen that battle happening in the Middle East in many respects, and it's a huge challenge. But going back to your original question about how do we achieve how do we bridge the gap between different interests? It's when affluent countries and more advanced countries agree to share the burden that otherwise would be faced by more less developed countries, I suppose.
Sure. Well, obviously we're here on this Trends platform.
Yeah.
Any final message or word you would like to give to our viewers or audience? Personally from you?
Yeah. The last key thing is and it's not like I'm not just here saying that because I'm in the UAE. It's that this country has made a huge strides when it comes to women's leadership. You can see it, you can feel it here. You could feel it's genuine, it's substantive, it's meaningful. And I think that this is a good opportunity for greater inclusion when it comes to this transition. So we're moving to a new type of economic growth, like an industrial revolution style transition. So why not, during this time, build the mechanisms in right away to help include people who are traditionally excluded from economic growth? So like what kind of carve out can we make in terms of climate finance? How many board members have to be women? How many co-founders have to be women? What percentage of funds have to be going to women entrepreneurs and to women providers in the Global South, for instance? That's the type of conversation we should be having now, so the economy of the future looks like our population, looks like the diversity that we have.
Right.
Yeah?
Absolutely.
So that's my last message.
Very interesting. Would love to have you once again in the studio when you come
Happy
visit
to.
us in the future.
Definitely.
By the way, one last thing. How was your experience so far in the Middle East?
Love it, man.
Yeah?
I love coming here all the time. It doesn't matter to me. It feels like home. The key thing is that no matter where you are in the world, you will always feel at home in the Middle East.
Right.
Yeah.
That's amazing. Ladies and gentlemen, there you have it. Maathiew Godwin, thank you so much for being here with us, and we look forward to hosting you once again in the future.
Absolutely right.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you very much indeed.